History would write them down as the Night Witches, a legend emerging from the darkness of night, catching the enemy in their sleep. They were the deadliest female snipers of World War II, and today we will tell their story. From ordinary lives to the heart of war. Until the summer of 1941, they were ordinary Soviet girls. Lyudmila was studying history at university. She dreamed of losing herself in books and becoming an academic one day. Roza was teaching kindergarten in a small town, dreaming of a future filled with children's laughter. Nina worked in a factory, supporting her family and waiting for the day she could build her own life. They all had dreams: love, family, career, an ordinary but hopeful life. But on the morning of June 22nd, 1941, everything changed. When the Nazi armies crossed our borders and invaded our land, all the lives that had been normal until that day were shattered in an instant. Villages were set on fire. Cities were bombed. Women were raped. Children were killed. People were displaced. That day, a silent rupture occurred in every home in the Soviet Union. War was no longer a distant threat. It was at the doorstep. It was precisely in the midst of this darkness that Marina Roskova, one of the country's most famous pilots, emerged. With special permission from Stalin, she made an unprecedented call. 3 separate military units, composed solely of women, would be formed. War pilots, bombers, and snipers. All would be selected from among women. This call quickly turned into a spark. Thousands of young women, even if they had never touched a rifle or approached an airplane before, flocked to registration centers to defend their homeland. They waited in line for hours, some in school uniforms, some in work clothes, some with just a few hastily gathered belongings. Their families begged them, "You're just a girl. You don't have to go. We can't lose you." But they looked them straight in the eye and said with determination, "That's exactly why I have to go." Because on that day, the fate of these young women changed. They were no longer just students, teachers, or workers. They were the last hope of the homeland, the unseen heroes of the war, the female soldiers who would write their names in history with blood and courage. Steel will, legendary training. The training was brutal, just as merciless as the war itself. Their training was equally harsh. The delicate, fragile-looking hands of these young women had to become strong enough to carry 5-kilogram rifles without flinching. Their slender fingers, which once seemed meant for holding a pen, braiding hair, or grasping a warm teacup, would now learn to pull the trigger with deadly precision. The recoil of the weapon would ache their arm bones and bruise their palms, but none of them had the right to complain. These young bodies, girls barely 18 or 19 years old, had to learn to lie motionless for hours in the snow, in freezing temperatures of -30 degrees. The cold froze not only their skin, but their bones. They learned to take short breaths, sometimes holding them completely, so their breath wouldn't show in the open air. Their fingertips went numb. Their eyelashes froze, and sometimes they got frostbite on their faces, but none of them used this as an excuse for weakness. They weren't just expected to be good marksmen. They had to be perfect soldiers. Discipline, obedience, endurance, and the ability to control their emotions. These were all essential qualities a soldier must possess, and these girls had to acquire them quickly. Their training began at dawn and continued with relentless intensity even after sunset. Each worked 12 hours a day without a break, completing grueling 15-kilometer training marches, crawling through wooded areas, sinking into mud, and getting back up, running with heavy equipment. They were required to fire over 500 rounds a day. Each shot meant they were one step closer to defending their homeland. As the days passed at the firing range, the sound of bullets was no longer a frightening explosion, but the echo of rhythmic determination. Their instructors showed them no mercy, leaving no room for sentimentality. Many of them were soldiers who had fought on the front lines, who had experienced the reality of blood, gunpowder, and loss. That's why a harsh and cold atmosphere formed every time they entered the training area. They shouted loudly, telling them one simple truth. Here, you will learn to kill your emotions. Every bullet you fire will end someone's life. Are you really ready for that? These words shook the girls every time, creating a momentary blankness on their faces. But there was no surrendering to fear. They all responded with their chests puffed out and the same determination. We are ready. They had to be ready, because no one had a second chance at the front. A moment's hesitation meant death. A wrong breath, a wrong move, a wrong decision would lead to irreversible consequences. So they reshaped themselves, as if hastily pulled out of childhood. They were no longer young girls playing games and dreaming. They had taken on a new identity. Soldiers who had learned to defy the cold, hunger, fear, and death. And this transformation made them people who could never return to their old lives. A legend is born in the darkness of night. Their first frontline experiences were far more than just a test. It was there that they first saw the much darker, much more brutal face of war than what was described in books or felt in training. When Lyudmila aimed at the first German soldier she killed, her hands trembled slightly. She felt the cold metal of the rifle in her palms, her heartbeat shaking her view through the scope. The sound she heard when she pulled the trigger was short, sharp, and more ordinary than she had expected. But what really shook her was the look of shock and incomprehension on the man's face as he fell to the ground. His eyes suddenly stared into the void. His body tensed involuntarily. Lyudmila knew even then that she would never forget that face. She couldn't sleep that night. The man's lifeless eyes seemed to stare at her from the darkness. But that same night, she also learned something. Emotions were a luxury on the front lines, even a danger. As the days passed, killing ceased to be a painful act and became a mathematical necessity for survival. Identifying the target, calculating the wind, pulling the trigger at the right angle. Each of these became a mechanical flow, completely devoid of emotion. Female snipers mostly preferred to work at night. Darkness was their ally, a natural cover that provided them with invisibility. They worked in pairs, one sniper, one spotter. The spotter scanned the surroundings with binoculars, analyzed the target's behavior, reported how much the wind affected the direction, and immediately warned when danger was sensed. The sniper would calmly pull the trigger in a single breath and retreat back into the darkness as soon as the target fell. There was never any unnecessary conversation during these operations. Every sound increased the risk of death. Over time, various legends about this invisible enemy began to circulate among German soldiers. Some said they waited in the trees all night. Others said they silently crawled up to the positions. They come out at night, kill with a single bullet, and disappear. Just like witches, became a warning whispered in the dark trenches. Knowing they were women further unsettled the German soldier's psyche. Many believed it was shameful to die by a woman's hand, and this fear kept them awake at night. Thus, the famous nickname that went down in history emerged: night witches. This name perfectly summed up their invisibility, lethality, and the fear they instilled. Lyudmila Pavlichenko became one of the most legendary fighters in these shadow units. Her incredible success in Odessa and Sevastopol attracted attention not only within the Soviet Union, but around the world. 309 confirmed kills, dozens of which were enemy officers, made her the deadliest female sniper in history. When the Germans heard her name, they trembled. In their frontline reports, they used the phrase, "Angel of Death." To them, Lyudmila was an invisible figure gliding through the darkness. Once you fell into the crosshairs of her scope, it meant your death sentence had already been passed. Lyudmila represented how the war transformed young women into myths, legends, deadly war machines. Her story echoed across the front lines as the sharpest example of how destructive and determined women could be in war. Heroism and loss. The two faces of war. Each of them was a hero for the Soviet Union. Newspapers proudly recounted their stories, and their faces became symbols of courage on propaganda posters. However, behind these shining tales of heroism lay deep, forgotten, and painful tragedies. 20-year-old Tanya, a young woman who had only recently left her childhood behind, tried to change her position after neutralizing 2 German soldiers. Everything suddenly went dark when she stepped on a mine hidden under the snow. As the explosion echoed through the forest, her friends didn't even have time to hear her scream. Nina, aged 21, was the kind of person who shielded her comrades even in the most dangerous moments of battle. One day, while trying to drag a seriously wounded comrade to safety, she was spotted and shot. Those who knew her said that even as she died, her eyes were filled not with fear, but with the helplessness of not being able to reach him. Roza Shanina, one of the brightest stars, lost her life in the final days of the war, just 2 months away from victory. She was only in her early 20s, carrying the weight of a world full of bullets in her forehead, yet still holding the hopes of a young girl in her heart. She wrote in her diary, "Maybe I will die, but another girl will survive and live in my place," as if she knew her fate, but was silently handing over the right to live to another woman who would live in her place. Throughout the war, more than 2,000 female snipers served on the front lines. All had undergone rigorous training, slept in the snow, waited for the enemy in the dark, and carried out their duties during the day, trembling with exhaustion. However, approximately 500 of these 2,000 women never returned to their homeland, their families, or the warm memories of their childhood. Their stories often remained mere statistics, yet each number represented a life cut short, a youth frozen in the trenches. War made them heroes, but it also silently consumed them. Each death left behind the innocent shadow of a dream, a future, a possibility of life. From legend to legacy, the unforgettable ones. When the war ended, the real struggle for the surviving women had only just begun. These young women, legendary for their resilience on the front lines, found themselves plunged into an invisible war that no one could see in peacetime. The never-ending struggle to learn to live with trauma. Many would suddenly wake up at night, the sound of explosions still ringing in their ears, reliving those dark nights spent freezing in the trenches. Flashbacks, nightmares, momentary freezes. Some would sometimes mistake the sound of a door for gunfire and throw themselves to the ground, while others would remember their old enemies when they saw a face disappear for a moment in a crowd. They had to be strong during the war, but no one had taught them what it meant to break in peacetime. Yet they felt no regret. Each knew the weight, necessity, and consequences of their duty. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, on her deathbed in 1974, uttered those truth-filled words one last time. "I only defended my homeland. I was not a killer. I was a savior." These words expressed a truth shaped by a lifetime of burden, blood, loss, and pride. Today, their legacy lives on, not only as a footnote in military history or a list of achievements, but also as a symbol of women's strength, determination, and courage. They proved that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can show unwavering resistance, and that hope can exist like a spark even in the coldest trenches. Although the smoke of war has long since dissipated, the mark they left continues to live on in history books and in the collective memory of humanity. The story of the Night Witches is a living testament to how ordinary people can transform into extraordinary beings of power, determination, and courage during the darkest days of war. These young women, who were just teachers, students, workers, or sisters yesterday, suddenly became legends who changed the course of history. Their story reminds us that the limits of the human spirit are much broader than we imagine, that hope can be created even in despair, that courage can blossom even in the midst of fear. Therefore, to forget this story is to forget not only the memory of a group of brave women, but also humanity's resilience and power of resistance. Keeping this story alive shows future generations how to shine a light in the darkness. If you want to learn about these unforgettable pages of history in a deeper, more compelling, and more realistic way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Because with each new documentary, a new story emerges from the dusty shelves of history. You can also share in the comments how you feel about these brave women, which moments affected you the most, and what you learned from this story. Because history only lives on if we talk about it. The world called them night witches. Their enemies remembered them with fear. But today, we remember them not just as soldiers, but as true heroes who emerged even in humanity's most difficult moments.